So Crux is a schemaless database. So you may be wondering why I've chosen to talk about schema, but you'll find out later on, kind of not having schema in the database means that we shift the problem to application developers and it becomes a blank canvas. And I'm really interested in database schema, and as we'll be talking about JSON schema, which I've begun to get into to try and understand what the domain looks like. We're very much in the Clojure community obsessed by data and data-driven applications, and we are also obsessed with metadata and making declarations in data about our data. It's a kind of a completely kind of data ecosystem, and so schema is important. But I spend a lot of my time working with JSON. Package.json in NPM, JSON in CloudFormation. I mean, there's hundreds of JSON. So hands up, who likes JSON? I mean, JSON is awesome, but in many ways it's not awesome. There are a lot of things out there that create JSON config files and requires commas, and if you don't structure it right, it kind of doesn't work. The worst thing for me about JSON is that you're not allowed to put comments in. And I think if there's just one thing that we shouldn't be leaving to the next generation, I mean, we're leaving a lot of problems, environmental catastrophe, plastics in the ocean. The one thing the future generation just doesn't need is lots of legacy tech with configuration files with no comments in them. So kind of what can we do about it? Well, for our source files, we can start using Eden, and Jux have a library called Aero, which is Eden with a few extra tag literals. Who's used Aero here? Yeah, it's quite a, so I think Aero is fantastic for writing configuration files that a lot of companies are using JSON for one reason, really, that it allows you to put comments in. So comments are great. You should comment your code. So I was kind of thinking about converting the whole world from JSON to Eden, because Eden's really cool. And I realized it's just, JSON is absolutely everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere in the way that XML was everywhere 10 years ago, and it's not going anywhere. Everybody writing microservices, they're not writing lots of different formats and MIME types, they're just spitting out JSON. JSON is the lingua franca of the internet. And so I've begun to make my peace with JSON and look at it in a different way. And kind of looking at this, what we're seeing is it's really just maps of maps and maps of lists and lists of lists and lists of maps, and it's nested maps and lists. That's awesome. If you're a Clojure developer, that's kind of all you need, because you know, guess what? What is the best programming language to process maps and maps of lists, right? It's a one-liner, right? To read in a JSON file, well, you need a Cheshire library, but it's a one-liner. I remember back in the day writing Java systems. I worked for a big telco, and we spent weeks writing deserializers and serializers. That's just to do the input and output from data into a Java system, into an object model and back. You know, computers are really meant to do kind of three things: input, process, output. And Java only does one of those things half well. So we're really, really privileged that we can just slurp in data formats like this. It's almost as if it was contrived by kind of the grand Lisp conspiracy of old. And I think one of the prominent members of this grand Lisp conspiracy, Guy Steele, you know, talked about how really we've somehow moved the whole world in the JavaScript system, in the browser, through this kind of JSON format. We are really, Lisp as one. It's funny to think about it. Nobody talks about Lisp anymore, but it's kind of ubiquitous everywhere now. So should we be really happy about JSON? So I've been looking at JSON schema. JSON schema is this kind of emerging specification. It's taking years and years to emerge. Hands up if you've heard of JSON schema. It's kind of like metadata for JSON. It allows you to say what you're allowed in a JSON document, which is kind of great. We had it with XML, we had an XML schema. What's the benefit over just kind of, is it just another specification language or a checker? Turns out when you have data and you combine it with metadata, you get superpowers. So one of the superpowers that I've noticed with JSON schema, you have JSON schema here at the top and some data, is that you can use this to generate UIs. That's kind of pretty cool. And I think there's a lot more that you can do with the JSON schema. Here I've got a couple of things I've been thinking about. First is Yes, you can do validation, UI generation. I think when JSON schema allows anybody in the world to come up with new keywords and define the semantics for those keywords. So I've been thinking about maybe protocol generation, the sort of thing that we use, Avro, protocol buff, thrift, those kind of things where you can describe, if you know what the JSON document is going to look like, you can generate stubs to say, well, okay, I know I'm going to only use 16 characters for this field. So you can create really efficient binary protocol formats. And I'm also experimenting with using JSON schema as a pull syntax. This is saying, well, this is the shape of document that I want to get from a database, which I wish it was in. So we're using a JSON schema to generate Crux queries, and the Crux queries will come up with results and tuples, which will then be stitched together back into result JSON documents. And the query is the schema, and the schema is the query. So you just get to write in JSON schema, maybe the same JSON schema that you've used to build a UI. You can say, this is the data I want, and Crux just does the magic stuff to make those documents come out, even if those documents don't exist in the database. So I think this is kind of a kind of pretty interesting horizon that we're looking at in Crux at the moment. I'm just announcing here a quick library that I've created. So there are Java libraries that do JSON schema. They tend to end up with, well, one in particular tends to end up with object graphs, which once you've got an object graph, you've got to use a dotted syntax to navigate. And as Clojure developers, we kind of hate that. We like to walk our trees and turn them upside down and transpose them and slurp them and spit them. So I wanted something quite native, and I wanted something to work in the front end as well in JavaScript. So I've created something that is more kind of familiar to Clojure developers, called the Jux JSON schema. I haven't got a nice, funky 4-letter word name. If you think of one, let me know and suggest one. But that's available. It's kind of in alpha, but it's being developed quite quickly. So that's out there tonight. And that's it. I'm going to hand over to John. So now we're really talking about proper Crux. That was a kind of little hors d'oeuvre or amuse bouche before we really get to the main course or starter.